The twin sons of Vespera beat down relentlessly on the desert town of Port Helios. Their merciless rays reflected off the weathered metal and stone buildings, casting long, harsh shadows over the dusty streets. The wind blew in from the barren, dunes carrying with it the scent of dry sand and scorched earth. Despite the heat, the bustling marketplace hummed with activity. Traders shouted their wares, children ran between the crowded stalls, and the clatter of machinery mixed with the distant hum of spacecraft engines. Among the crowd, a lone figure moved carefully through the marketplace. She was wrapped in a faded sand-colored cloak which had seen better days. Nara pulled the fabric tighter around herself and her daughter, Lana, shielding them both from the sun's burning heat. Nara's blue-tinted skin and violet hair stood out starkly against the desert backdrop, marking her as an outsider, a fact she could not ignore. She had lived on Vespera long enough to know that outsiders, especially ones with children, were seldom given a fair chance. Lana, with her soft, pink skin and dark curls, clung to her mother's side. Her bright eyes, wide with curiosity, scanned the crowd, but Nara could sense the anxiety in the little girl's gaze. It was the same look Nara had seen countless times, the look of a child who had learned far too early that the world was a harsh and unkind place. "Mama, I'm thirsty," Lana whispered, her tiny voice barely audible over the noise of the marketplace. Nara paused for a moment, her eyes scanning the street. There was a food stall not too far ahead, the scent of spiced meat skewers drifting in the air. She could feel the familiar ache in her stomach as it growled in protest. They hadn't had a proper meal in days, and the few credits they had left wouldn't be enough to buy both food and water. "Just a little longer, sweetheart," Nara murmured, forcing a smile she didn't feel. She knew that she couldn't afford to stop. They had barely enough credits for another night's stay at the rundown hostel they'd been living in, let alone enough to buy food or supplies for the coming days. The last 3 months had been a blur of rejection after rejection. No one wanted to hire an outsider, especially one with a small child in tow. The locals, especially the Sethlons, with their multi-eyed faces and crystalline skin, looked at her like she was a nuisance. They referred to people like Nara as warm bloods, a term that seemed to carry nothing but contempt. As Nara passed the food stall, the burly Sethlon vendor behind the counter eyed her suspiciously. He didn't need to say anything. His sharp, multi-eyed glare was enough. "Keep moving, Blueskin," he growled, his voice as harsh as the wind that whipped through the marketplace. "No handouts here." Nara's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. She quickened her pace, trying to hold back the frustration that threatened to rise in her chest. Maya shouldn't have to live like this, scrambling for scraps on the edges of civilized space, trying to survive while the rest of the universe moved on, indifferent to her struggles. But as hard as it was, Nara knew that it was still better than the alternative. It was still better than being caught by her people, than being forced to return to the cold, rigid world she had fled from. A world where genetic purity meant everything, and where her daughter's very existence was seen as an abomination. Just as Nara lost herself in these thoughts, her world collided with another. Literally. She had been so lost in her own mind that she hadn't noticed the man standing in her path. Before she could react, she had bumped into him, stumbling backward and nearly losing her grip on Lana. Strong hands steadied her before she could fall. "I'm so sorry," Nara began, but the words faltered in her throat as she looked up. The man who had caught her was human, but he didn't look like the usual rough frontier type. His hair was sun-bleached, trimmed neatly, and he wore simple, well-maintained work clothes. He had a weathered face, the kind that told of years spent working hard under the sun, yet his eyes, striking green, held no hint of the usual suspicion that most locals had when looking at Nara. "No harm done," he said with an easy smile. "Though, you might want to watch your step around here. Some folks aren't as forgiving of accidents." Nara blinked in surprise. She had expected a reprimand or a cold glare, but instead the man's voice was calm, almost warm. She could hardly remember the last time someone had spoken to her without judgment in their tone. "I've noticed," Nara replied softly, adjusting her cloak. Lana, ever the curious child, peeked out from behind her mother's legs, her eyes wide as she took in the stranger. The man's gaze flickered to Lana for a moment, before returning to Nara. Something shifted in his expression, not pity but understanding, an understanding that made Nara's chest tighten. "My name's Jax Fraser," he said, extending a hand. "I run a repair shop over on Docking Row." Nara hesitated before taking his hand. There was something about him, something in the steady warmth of his gaze, that made her pause. "Nara," she replied, her voice quiet. "And this is Lana." Jax crouched, down to Lana's level, offering her a smile that was both kind and gentle. "Hello there, little lady," he said. For a moment, Lana simply stared at him, unsure, but then, to Nara's surprise, the little girl offered a tiny wave. Her shy demeanor softened in the presence of this man. "You know," Jack said, standing up again, "I couldn't help but notice that you've been making the rounds at the local businesses, asking for work." Nara's heart skipped a beat. How could he know that? She had been trying to keep a low profile, slipping in and out of the shops hoping for a chance, any chance. "We're just looking for honest work," Nara replied, her voice steady despite the knot forming in her stomach. Jack seemed to consider this for a moment, then nodded. "As it happens, I might be able to help with that. My shop's just around the corner. If you'd like to discuss it, I'd be happy to." Every instinct Nara had, every instinct honed by months of hardship, screamed at her to refuse. Kindness from strangers often came with a cost. But there was something in Jax's steady gaze, something that made her hesitate. "What kind of work?" she asked cautiously. "Basic maintenance," Jax explained, gesturing toward a side street. "Cleaning, inventory, nothing complicated. I've got a spare room if you need it too." Nara hesitated, her mind racing. Could she trust him? Could they afford not to take the chance? "Lead the way," she said quietly. And with that, a new chapter began, one filled with hope, uncertainty, and the promise of a chance. Nara and Lana followed Jax down the narrow side street, their footsteps echoing softly on the dusty pavement. The heat was suffocating, the twin suns still high in the sky, casting long shadows across the road. Jax's shop was just a short walk away, its walls lined with mismatched panels of metal and weathered wood. It wasn't much, but for Nara, it felt like a small oasis in the desert of rejection she had been navigating for months. Jax led them through a rusted metal door into the heart of the shop, which was cluttered with tools, spare parts, and half-dismantled machines. The air inside was cooler than the oppressive heat outside, and the low hum of the air conditioning system was a welcome sound after the relentless desert winds. The place had the feel of organized chaos, tools and gadgets scattered around, but there was an order to it, a rhythm that Nara could almost sense beneath the surface. "This is the main area," Jack said, gesturing toward the central space where a small spacecraft sat on a raised platform. Its panels were removed, exposing the complex inner workings of its engine. "I run a small repair business here, mostly basic work, but we get some interesting jobs from time to time." Nara looked around, taking in the array of tools and diagnostic equipment lining the walls. It wasn't much, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of hope. The small, cozy apartment upstairs and the steady work that Jax had promised seemed like a dream compared to the cold uncertainty of the days before. "Is it just you?" Nara asked, her voice softer than usual. The thought of being alone in a new place, away from everything familiar, was daunting. Jax shook his head. "I've got Milo," he said, and just as he spoke, a tall, broad-shouldered man appeared from the back of the shop. He had an air of quiet confidence, his hands stained with oil and grime, a tool belt hanging low around his waist. "Milo," Jax introduced. "This is Nara, and this is her daughter, Lana." Milo gave a nod of acknowledgement, his expression neutral but not unfriendly. "Nice to meet you," he said gruffly, wiping his hands on a rag. "Jax told me you'd be joining us." He turned to Nara and gave her a quick, assessing look before adding, "You're a good hand, I hope?" Nara smiled faintly, though it was more out of politeness than confidence. "I'll do my best," she said, not wanting to admit that she had no real experience with machines. She had grown up surrounded by technology, but that was different. Her world had been all about clean, efficient tools, not this rugged, hands-on work. Still, she was determined to learn. She had no choice. "Don't worry," Jack said, noticing her hesitation. "Milo can show you the ropes. He's been with me for years, knows his place inside out." Milo grunted in agreement, his demeanor shifting slightly as he glanced at Nara. "We'll take it slow at first," he said, his voice rough but not unkind. "Start with the basics. Cleaning, organizing, that kind of stuff. We'll see where it goes from there." The next few days passed in a blur of new experiences. Nara spent most of her time tidying up the workshop, sorting through the piles of spare parts, and cleaning the tools. It was mundane work, but it kept her busy, and more importantly, it kept Lana safe. The little girl was content to sit quietly in the corner of the workshop, drawing pictures with old, discarded markers Jax had found for her. She had even begun to speak a little more, her shyness slowly melting away as she got used to the new environment. As the days went on, Nara grew more comfortable with the routine. She learned how to organize the parts and began to understand the layout of the shop. Jax and Milo were patient with her, teaching her the basics of the machines, how to handle the diagnostic tools, and what to look for in a repair job. But it wasn't just the work that was changing Nara. There was something about Jax's kindness that began to break through the wall she had built around herself. She found herself looking forward to their conversations, even though they were brief, and mostly about the work. Jax had a quiet way of asking about her day, of checking in with her without pushing her to open up. And though Nara still kept much of her past hidden, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude for the first real kindness she had experienced in years. It was on the fourth day that things began to change. Nara was cleaning one of the workbenches when Jax approached her, his face serious. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low. "I've got a few things I need help with, nothing too complicated. You've been doing well here, and I think you're ready to try your hand at some real work." Nara stopped what she was doing and looked up at him. "What kind of work?" she asked, her heart skipping a beat. She had grown comfortable with the routine of cleaning and organizing, but real work? That was something else entirely. Jax gave a small smile, but it was tinged with something more. Encouragement maybe, or something more personal. "I've got a ship coming in tomorrow that needs some maintenance, basic stuff, oil changes, system checks, nothing too technical. But it's a start, if you want it." Nara hesitated. The idea of taking on real responsibility was both terrifying and exhilarating. Could she really do it? Could she prove to Jax, and to herself, that she was capable of more than just cleaning? "I'm ready," she said after a moment, her voice steady despite the anxiety that churned in her stomach. Jax's smile widened. "Good. I'll show you what to do. And if you need help, just ask." The next day, Nara found herself standing in front of a sleek, shiny ship, its smooth hull gleaming. In the midday sun, she was nervous, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her work gloves. But as Jax guided her through the steps, explaining the basics of maintenance and showing her the systems she would need to check, she began to feel a strange sense of confidence. She could do this. She had to. And when the day ended, when the ship was back in working order and the repairs completed, Nara felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She had taken the first step toward something new, toward a future she could build for herself and Lana. Later that evening, after dinner, as Lana settled into bed in their new apartment, Nara stood at the small window looking out at the desert beyond. The sun had set and the stars were beginning to twinkle in the vast sky above. She touched the pendant around her neck, a small, hidden reminder of the life she had left behind. For the first time, in a long while, Nara allowed herself to hope. This place, this small shop in the desert, wasn't just a temporary stop. It was a chance. And maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something better. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind her. Jax had come to check in, as he often did, to see how she was settling in. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Nara saw something unspoken in his gaze, something that made her chest tighten. "How was your first day?" he asked, his voice low, almost gentle. "It was good," Nara replied, her voice steady. "It felt right." Jax nodded, his smile genuine. "I'm glad." And for the first time in a long while, Nara believed him. The days grew longer as Nara adjusted to her new life in the repair shop. The simple rhythm of work, cleaning, repairing, organizing, became a welcome comfort. Each task, though mundane, felt like a small victory. For the first time in months, she no longer had to worry about where her next meal would come from, or how she would keep Lana safe. They had a roof over their heads, food in their bellies, and a sense of stability that had eluded them for so long. But as much as Nara tried to bury her past, it lingered like a shadow in the back of her mind. Her thoughts would often drift to the life she had left behind, the cold, unforgiving world where genetic purity was everything, where Lana's very existence was seen as an abomination. The people who had once called her family now hunted her, driven by the fear of what her daughter could become. That fear had forced her to run, to leave everything behind and start anew on a distant world where no one knew her name or her bloodline. It wasn't easy. Every time Nara caught herself looking over her shoulder, expecting to see someone from her past, her heart would race with anxiety. She had become adept at hiding, at keeping her head down and avoiding notice. But every now and then, the dread of being found would return, and she would be reminded of how fragile her new life truly was. Jax had noticed the change in her. He had seen the moments when Nara's smile faded, when her hands trembled slightly as she worked, and when her eyes would cloud over with distant thoughts. He didn't press her for details. He never asked her about her past. But Nara knew he was paying attention. She had grown to trust him, more than she had trusted anyone in years. He was kind, patient, and most importantly, he never treated her like an outsider. But there were still things about her past she couldn't share, things that made her feel as though she would never truly belong, no matter how much she wanted to. One evening, after a long day of repairs and inventory, Nara found herself standing outside the shop, staring up at the twin moons of Vespera. The desert wind had picked up, rustling the sand as it swept across the empty streets. Lana had already gone to bed, her small form curled up in the corner of their modest apartment. For the first time in a while, Nara felt the weight of the silence settle over her, the quiet of a world that felt both too big and too small at the same time. It was then that Jax stepped out, his silhouette framed by the doorway. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. Nara didn't say anything at first. She simply nodded, allowing him to step beside her. The two of them stood in silence for a while, the soft glow of the twin moons casting pale light over the desert landscape. Nara could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken words that hung between them. She had never been good at talking about her feelings, especially not the ones that made her feel vulnerable. But with Jax, it felt different. There was no pressure, no expectation. Just the quiet companionship of someone who understood without needing to ask. "You've been quiet lately," Jax said finally, breaking the silence. "Is everything okay?" Nara took a deep breath, her eyes still fixed on the horizon. "I don't know," she admitted softly. "Some days it feels like I'm finally starting to find a place here, a place where we belong. But then I remember who I am, who Lana is, and I wonder how long it'll last." Jax's gaze shifted to her, his eyes narrowing slightly in concern. "What do you mean?" Nara hesitated, her fingers curling around the edges of her cloak. She hadn't meant to say that much, hadn't meant to let her guard down so easily. But something about Jax's quiet presence made it feel like it was okay to be vulnerable. "I'm not who I seem to be," she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "And Lana, she's different. I don't know how much longer we can hide. The people I ran from, they'll never stop looking for us, and I can't protect her forever." Jax didn't say anything at first. He simply stood there, listening to her words. Nara could feel the weight of her own confession settle over her, heavy and suffocating. She wanted to say more, to explain the fear that gripped her heart every time she heard a ship's engines overhead, or saw strangers watching them from a distance. But she couldn't. She had never been good at explaining the weight of her past, the dark secret that had driven her to flee and start a new life on a faraway world. Jax finally spoke, his voice low but firm. "You're not alone in this, Nara. You and Lana, you're not alone. Whatever's chasing you, whatever's in your past, it doesn't change the fact that you're here now, and I'm here with you." Nara turned to him, her eyes wide with surprise. She had expected him to pull away, to dismiss her fears as the wild imaginings of someone who had been running for too long. But instead, he was looking at her with something softer in his eyes, something she hadn't seen in a long time. It was the look of someone who didn't judge, someone who simply cared. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice shaking slightly. "You don't know what that means to me." Jax gave a small smile, though there was something sad in his eyes. "I can imagine," he said, his tone gentle. "I don't need to know your whole story, Nara, but I do know this. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. You're not alone." For the first time in what felt like forever, Nara felt a flicker of warmth in her chest. It wasn't the burning intensity of hope that she had once known, but something steadier, something she could hold on to. It was the beginning of trust, of a bond that she hadn't known she could form again. As the two of them stood there in the quiet of the desert night, Nara allowed herself to feel something she hadn't dared to feel in so long. A tentative hope. She wasn't sure what the future held or how long they could stay hidden, but for the first time she believed that maybe, just maybe, she had found a place where they could be safe. And in the distance, beyond the dusty streets of Port Helios, the winds of change were stirring. The days that followed were filled with a newfound sense of determination. Nara, now more integrated into the workshop's rhythms, found herself gaining confidence in ways she hadn't expected. Jax had entrusted her with more responsibility, and she was eager to prove that she could be an asset to the shop. She had quickly learned the intricacies of ship maintenance, from replacing fuel filters to fine-tuning navigation systems. Each task was a small victory, a reminder that she was capable of more than just surviving. She could rebuild, repair, and contribute. But despite the satisfaction that came with the work, Nara couldn't shake the ever-present worry gnawing at her. She knew that the past had a way of catching up, and she feared the day when it would catch up with her and Lana. Every time a ship passed overhead, her heart would race in fear, wondering if it was the one coming to find her. She knew the longer they stayed in Port Helios, the greater the chance someone would recognize her, or worse, recognize Lana. It was one evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the desert in a fiery glow, that the storm Nara had been dreading finally arrived. She had just finished closing up the shop for the night when a loud knock echoed through the door. At first, Nara thought it was one of the usual late-night customers, perhaps someone needing a quick repair. But as she opened the door, she froze. Standing in front of her was a man she had hoped never to see again. Dorian, one of the emissaries from her old world. His cold, calculating eyes locked onto hers, and Nara could feel the blood drain from her face. Behind him stood two armed guards, their sleek, crystalline armor gleaming under the dim light of the street. They were Sethlon, like the ones she had encountered in the marketplace, and their four eyes gleamed with suspicion. "Dorian," Nara said, her voice steady despite the fear curling in her stomach. "What are you doing here?" Dorian's lips curled into a thin, cold smile. "I'm here for what's mine, Nara," he said, his voice sharp. "The girl. You know the laws. She must return to the Dominion. Her existence is an offense to our bloodline, and her absence has caused a great disturbance in the balance." Nara felt her heart race. She had known this day would come. But now that it had, she wasn't prepared for the weight of it. Lana was in the back room playing with a small set of mechanical parts she had found in the shop. Nara had to protect her. She couldn't let them take her. She couldn't let them take her daughter. She's mine now, Nara said, her voice firm, more resolute than she felt. She's not going anywhere with you. Dorian's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold determination. You don't understand, do you? He said, stepping closer, his gaze never leaving her. You think you can hide, but you can't outrun the Dominion. They will never stop looking for you, and neither will I. The Council has already sent their word. The hunt has begun. It's only a matter of time before they find you, and then what? You think this human can protect you? He glanced over at Jax, who had emerged from the back of the shop, his face pale as he surveyed the situation. You've made a mistake, Jax said quietly, but with a dangerous calmness in his voice. He stepped forward, standing between Nara and Dorian. I don't know who you are or what you want, but you won't be taking anyone anywhere. Dorian's eyes flickered with annoyance before he gave a slight mocking laugh. And what are you going to do, human? You're not equipped to handle this. He gestured toward his guards. They don't have the same concerns you do. They'll tear you apart before you can even blink. Jax didn't flinch. He reached down to his waist, where a small hidden blaster was holstered. Nara's eyes widened. She hadn't known he carried a weapon. The sight of it, however, made her stomach twist with dread. This wasn't just a confrontation over a simple misunderstanding. This was real, and the danger was closer than she had ever feared. Leave, Jax said, his voice low but unwavering. You don't belong here. For a moment, Dorian seemed to consider the situation. His eyes darted between Jax and Nara, and something in his expression darkened. Then, he shook his head with a smirk. I don't need to fight you, human. I have other ways. He snapped his fingers, and the Sethlon guards stepped forward, their weapons raised. Before anything could happen, there was a loud, crashing sound from the back room. Nara's heart leapt into her throat. She turned to see Lana standing in the doorway, her small figure glowing faintly with a soft pink light. The energy surrounding her pulsed with an intensity that made the air in the room thrum. Dorian, no, Nara shouted, rushing toward her daughter. Lana's eyes glowed brighter, and without warning, the mechanical tools on the workbench began to lift into the air, floating as if guided by an unseen hand. The tools spun around in a swirling vortex, their edges sharp, their movements graceful, almost like a dance. Dorian stepped back, his eyes wide in shock. What is this? He muttered, his voice laced with disbelief. Nara placed herself in front of Lana, shielding her with her body. This is my daughter, she said firmly, her voice filled with pride and defiance. And you will not touch her. The Sethlon guards hesitated, their weapons lowered slightly. Dorian, however, seemed to regain his composure. She's more powerful than we thought, he said, his tone darkening. But we will take her, one way or another. Jack stepped forward, his expression hardening. Not if I have anything to say about it. With a swift motion, he activated his blaster. But before he could take aim, there was another loud crash, followed by the sound of a door slamming open. A figure appeared in the doorway, Milo, the mechanic. He was holding a long, thick metal pipe, his face set in a grim line. You're not going anywhere, Milo said, his voice gruff but determined. If you want them, you'll have to get through me first. The tension in the room was unbearable. Nara's heart raced, her breath shallow. This was it. The storm she had feared had arrived. There was no more hiding, no more running. But as she looked at Jax, at Milo, and at Lana, who stood strong beside her, glowing with a quiet power, Nara realized that this time she wasn't alone. With a fierce resolve, Nara made her decision. Get them out of here, she said, her voice steady. I won't let you take my daughter. I won't let you take our future. In that moment, something inside her shifted. She was no longer the fugitive running from her past. She was the protector of her family, and she would fight for them no matter the cost. As the first shots were fired, the battle for their future began.